Yay!
Let's see if it actually happened on YouTube, so I can remember to mute it.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Open my other tab.
Let's see. There we go.
I see it.
Muted. And we'll wait like a few minutes so people can trickle in. And I should probably post it on the Twitter that we are live.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt.
I honestly don't understand how I do this every time, but I forget how I pull up the chat so that I can type while I'm like still in the video. It's like, how many times have we done this now? And I'm like, what am I doing?
Oh, Nana's here.
Yay!
You copied my message, Kara.
What?
No, you didn't. I'm messing with you.
Oh.
We all had the same sentiment going on.
I thought I had like typed in a different chat. I was like, oh my god, did I actually forget how to use?
That would be something. Wait a second. And Mary Margaret's here.
Hi,
Yay,
Mary
friends!
Margaret. I'm not texting during the live show. I'm posting on Twitter. So.
Sure, that's what you want us to think. We know you're just chatting with your boyfriend while we're
that thing I always do during live shows.
Yeah, yes. You're hosting. You're like, oh, sorry, hold on.
I have to tell him about my thoughts on Letter from Birmingham Jail. Let's see. Bare Bones tweet. There we go.
Perfect. That's all it takes.
I don't know why. Like sometimes, like I had a hard time coming up with like creative tweets for this because I'm like, I can't really make goofs on this subject matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was like, hey, this is happening.
It gets the job done.
Be there if you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should probably charge my computer.
That's a good call.
Yeah. And I think you can probably get started now. Okay. So, hi everyone, and welcome to our Past Classics live show for the month of March. I know it's in April, and it's been throwing me off for a while. And as you know, we have read Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail. I'm Taylor from Page Screen Taylor. Obviously, you're on my channel. So would you all like to go around and introduce yourselves and also let us know if this is your first time reading this or what your relationship with this text is?
Okay, I'll go first.
Yes.
Actually, so this is my first time reading this. I listened to it as an audiobook, but then obviously I also got myself a physical copy because one, I really enjoyed it, and two, I was like, it'll just be easier to discuss if I can like visually go back and refer to things. But I had never read this in school, actually. My only like experience having read anything of Martin Luther King Jr.'s was just the classic I Have a Dream speech. So it was a really, really wonderful experience.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cara?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Cara. Obviously, like, I think most people watching have been following like our subsequent live shows.
It's our loyal little band of classics readers.
Yes. I think I read excerpts of this in one of my AP English classes. We studied it when we were discussing rhetoric and kind of like different persuasive techniques and just like ways of constructing like a speech or an argument. So I think we read not all of it, but we read some pretty long excerpts, which I really enjoyed. And that's one of the pieces that has really stuck with me, like even after reading it like several years ago in high school. And I don't think I'd ever gotten around to reading the whole thing. So this was kind of a combination reread and first time reading the whole letter. And I also thought it was fantastic. I'm really glad that Taylor picked this one so that I have like a concrete reason to actually return to this and read the whole thing. So yes, I also thought it was great.
And like you two, this is also my first time reading it in its entirety. I'm sure I've seen quotes pulled out at random points, but I had only really read I have a dream, not I had a dream. I have a dream. But I am also really happy that I have a physical copy of it. It's something that I would like to go back to, and I know I'm going to go back to given the current climate. And actually, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, but I sort of wanted to give an overview of Martin Luther King Jr. because I realize that not everyone may know who he is. So he was a Black civil rights leader in like the 50s and 60s. He was a preacher. He was a reverend. That was it. Also, side note, he and I went to the same university. He got his doctorate from Boston University, which is where I went for undergrad. Fun little fact. His name was also Michael King Jr. We were talking about this before the live show. His father, Michael King Sr., went on a trip to Germany and learned about Martin Luther and decided to change his name. And Martin Luther King Jr. was like 6-ish, and he just changed his name as well. So that's how he became Martin Luther King Jr. And basically, Martin Luther King Jr.'s like whole philosophy towards civil rights was sort of nonviolent protest. So sitting in at lunch counters, sitting in at buses, peacefully protesting. And because he was technically breaking rules, like sitting in segregated areas that were designated for whites only, he was arrested a lot. But he led this whole movement, and he was unfortunately assassinated in 1968. So I wanted to go into that. And Letter from a Birmingham Jail, there's like a description in my thing. He wrote this essay in the form of an open letter on April 16, 1963, while he was serving a sentence for participating in civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. And he's basically writing this essay to some other religious leaders who disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s, form of protest. So that's sort of the background. Yes?
I just wanted to chime in since we're doing fun facts. I did not know that he had written this whole thing like in newspaper margins in jail. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Like, imagine writing it down the edge of a newspaper.
Yeah, like off the top, no editing, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that he wrote it in jail, and it's amazing because I can barely write anything coherent outside of jail.
Yeah. I could be in ideal conditions and be like, I see fluffy cat. Okay, did it.
Yeah,
racism bad.
Yeah, the fact that he's like, I'll just jot down a few ideas, and it's become this seminal text of persuasion. Yeah.
So, I also wanted to get everyone's background on how your education regarding Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement was, because another thing about the United States is that there are different standards for teaching about slavery and the civil rights movement in different parts of the United States. So, for example, in some states, they teach people that slaves were all happy and sometimes they had nice masters and it was great. And obviously in other places, they teach that slavery was a bad thing, actually, and people weren't happy. And I feel like a lot of the civil rights movement has also been sanitized as well. So I just wanted to get everyone's background on how they learned about Martin Luther King and civil rights as well. So we could do Julia first, since we started in that order.
Okay. So I was going to say, fortunately, not for better or for worse. So I've lived in Michigan for all of my school years. So being a very northern state, I think for the most part, we have definitely not had an overly sanitized version of civil rights or slavery. We were always taught that was bad. Yeah. History is full of bad things. These are some of them. So that's good at least. But I do think maybe just because of trying to keep things age appropriate, even from elementary school, I remember doing a project that was hanging in my basement for years that was a little paper cloud, and it said Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. This is my dream. And then it had 3 little clouds hanging down from it. That was I think it was my dream for me, my dream for my community, and my dream for the world or something. So it was just very simplified. And I don't know what I wrote. They probably weren't anything amazing. It's probably I dream of peace. I dream of getting a cat. I don't know. So I do remember knowing who he was and being familiar. And then I remember, I think I was in a college, maybe my freshman year writing class, where we read in full the I Have a Dream speech. But I don't remember what we did with it, what the assignment was afterwards. But yeah, I don't know. That's an overview of my familiarity.
Yeah. So I went to school in California, and similarly to Julia, I think, although we definitely had gaps or things that were kind of glossed over, I think overall we did a pretty good job of being honest. At least about slavery. I do think that the civil rights era was, Taylor, as you said, kind of sanitized. And we talked about Dr. King a lot, but it's interesting because we talked about very specific parts of his work a lot. Like we talked about the I Had a Dream speech quite a bit, but like, for example, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if I don't think we talked about Letter from Birmingham Jail when I was younger. I think that was just when I got to high school that we read parts of it. But like, I'm pretty sure we didn't talk about the whole white moderates section of that, for example. So I think he was definitely held up as like a kind of palatable figure for the civil rights movement. And we did talk about him, like what he accomplished and what he did. And like, I'm not saying that my school made him more important than he was, because he was extremely important, but I think he kind of became like, and this is what we're going to do with civil rights, is we're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and all right, that's it, we're done. Like, yeah, so that was kind of my background with his work. And I also remember Julia doing several of those activities when we were younger, like very like kid appropriate. And I don't remember either that we spent much time at all. For one thing, talking about the more, like, he was a nonviolent protester, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the more, I guess, assertive parts of his speeches. Like, it was always about peace, and it was always about, nonviolent protests and everything. We didn't really talk about when he would get, I don't even want to say angry, but when he would be more assertive about it, like some of the sections in the letter. Yeah, and like I said, we did a lot of those kind of activities with his work, some of which I think were more helpful than others. And I definitely don't think we talked about the fact that he was assassinated very much. Like, I think, like, we mentioned it, we knew it happened, but yeah, I think in general, the civil rights era, we were kind of like, and then racism went away because of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and we're done.
Thanks, you two.
Yeah, so that's pretty much, yeah, that's how my experience went.
Mine is also similar to the two of you. Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to interrupt you, Taylor. I'm going to do yours, but can we come back to me before the next question, just because I had a thought?
Oh, you can go ahead. I hadn't.
No, do yours, because I won't forget.
Okay. So, like Cara, I also grew up in California, so very, I guess a very liberal area, depending on where you are. But where I was, so we did learn about like slavery in the civil rights era, but it also was incredibly sanitized. We didn't hear anything about what King thought about the white moderate. We learned that they always taught us that there was some sort of rivalry between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X for some reason. Yeah. And like, I know they disagreed on a lot, but I don't think they were enemies. They just didn't do that. And we never learned about the Black Panthers and the role they played in the civil rights era. I never learned really about Malcolm X. I don't even think I heard his name until I was 17. And I never learned about Freddie Hampton Jr. until I was in college. Just certain civil rights leaders are completely erased for this more sanitized, palatable version that back when Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting, people thought he was too much too, which is wild to me. So it was always very sanitized. Martin Luther King was always just like this peaceful guy. He was assassinated by someone. We never learned who in our classes. And we were also taught that racism ended, I guess, when he died. And America wasn't racist. You're welcome.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think as you get older, you tend to be a little more disillusioned with how the civil rights era was taught to us and how it simultaneously accomplished so much, but didn't accomplish enough. But because it accomplished like desegregation and so on, people were like, that's a fine stopping point. We're good. Right. But yeah, that was sort of my approach. Julia, what did you want to say?
Now I have two thoughts, so stop me if I'm going on too long. One, when you guys were talking about him being the palatable version of what to teach. Also, Rosa Parks, who wasn't even the first woman who sat on the bus and was like, no, I won't move. But then they were like, hey, Rosa, you're like a sweet old lady. Can you do this so the white people will be sympathetic towards you? And she's like, sure. Like, okay, because a pregnant teenager doesn't work for you guys. I get it.
Exactly.
I get it.
And the colorism, too.
Yes, and colorism, which, by the way, one of the best episodes of Drunk History, if I might add.
Yeah.
Great show.
So good.
And then the other thing I was going to say was, I was thinking about this when, Cara, you were talking about like the school assignments and stuff. Like, as someone who has a degree in elementary education, what I think would be so much like more meaningful, for lack of a better word, or like impactful maybe, like instead of doing the like, what's your dream for the world, like how about we pull I wish I knew her name. You guys are gonna know who I'm talking about. Maybe her name is Jane. She's like an educator who does like the blue eye brown eye thing. Yes. So she's like, oh yeah, if you have blue eyes, you sit over here and da-da-da. And even if you don't want to do that, like as a classroom, you know, riff off MLK's like just laws and unjust laws and be like, good morning, students. Today the rule is you have to call me, you know, ultimate queen of the classroom. And if you don't, you have to do 20 push-ups, and then see which students are like, no, this is stupid. We're not doing this. Like, and then talk about that thematically. Yeah. Like, I feel like that's so much more meaningful to like experience.
And going off of that, I know we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but the unjust laws versus just laws thing, that's also not really taught in class. We taught like who broke the rules, but we didn't really go deeper into that. Like here, the lie, or not the lie, but the law was wrong, and what makes an unjust law and what makes a just law. And that was never taught to us. It was always like, oh, follow the law. But
yeah, I think we talked a little bit about the fact that it was actually a law. Like segregation was like literally enshrined in our legal system for a long time. But one thing that we definitely didn't discuss in school at all is the fact that, like, okay, I don't know how to explain this exactly, but the way we talked about it almost implied that segregation is the only racist law that would be bad enough to break. You know, like we were like the way it was taught was almost like, well, this was such a special case that Martin Luther King Jr. and everyone else had to break this law, but normally you shouldn't do that. And it's like completely ignoring the fact that there are other unjust laws that are still around that are breaking. So,
and things that aren't even laws, but just sort of subconscious. Like we never get subconscious bias. You know, you might not be saying, I don't like this person because they're Black, but you could be like, I don't like this person for some reason. And it might occur to you that there's an inner bias. Like, so much about race and racism has been sanitized in our school system. And they're always difficult conversations. But I think especially nowadays, there are conversations worth getting into.
Yeah. And I think students can handle more than adults think. Like, I think there's definitely, you shouldn't be teaching it to like 5-year-olds the way you teach it to college students, obviously. But it's like, I think kids, especially, it's like they have ideas about right and wrong before. Well, and Julia, you have a degree in this, so like, you know, but it's like there's ways to not like completely go beyond their like comprehension level and still start introducing them to these ideas of like, hey, just because something is written down in a textbook doesn't mean that's the whole story, or it doesn't mean like, like there's ways to do it.
Yeah.
Scaffolding. You take what they know and you take them a little bit above that.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also encourage curiosity. Like kids nowadays have, like, they can go on their parents' iPad or something and look up stuff on their own. Maybe, maybe depending on what you want to encourage. But also, though, speaking about like not introducing kids to drastic things at 5, this is a little off topic, but I think you two read the American Girl series. Did any of you read the Addie books?
I did.
Were traumatic.
I don't think I ever read those for some reason. I might have read one out of order, but I remember you telling us this before about like how they go in. Like,
yeah, they weren't ones that I reread like I did with Felicity. Like that was my girl. But I do remember being like, oh, okay.
They did not hold back.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, maybe don't go Addie far with her.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to ask, because I had really I kind of skipped over this question because I got super excited to talk about the education system, because a lot of people in my family are teachers. But I know this is a really hard piece of work to rate. And so I don't really want to go into star ratings as much, because I feel like something like that is so complicated. But I wanted to know what your thoughts were on the text as a whole.
Do we want to go the same order or different?
We could mix it up, Cara.
Sure. Yeah, Taylor, as you said, it's hard even talking about like yes, this was a brilliant speech. Like let me analyze it as I would any other piece of writing. But I do think it was so well written. I think it was very clearly and effectively written. I think that the way Dr. King can use such beautiful images while also using very clear language, I think that is a real gift that I think it's in a way kind of rare, I think, for nonfiction writers to be able to balance those things. So what feels effortlessly. I'm sure, like, obviously he did put a lot of effort into it. But yeah, I thought it was very effective. I thought it was very like clearly reasoned. Like I definitely understand why we talked about it in the context of rhetoric in my high school classes, like, because it's such a great example of a persuasive piece. And I also was very struck by, which we've kind of touched on already, that even though there is this very clear sense of love and hope throughout, which is pretty amazing given what he had already been through and what Black people in America had been going through for hundreds of years, even though there is that kind of like hope and that feeling that this is going to end at some point, things are going to get better, at least a little bit. I was very struck by the pieces of this that are more, I don't mean angry. I'm trying to think of a word for what I mean, but it's like are more unflinching, I guess. Yeah, so like I was very, very struck by those. And yeah, I just thought this was a great piece of writing. Like it obviously represents a lot in our history as well, but even as a piece of writing itself, I thought it was just really brilliantly done.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, not to share quotes so early, but Cara, like, I feel like this is one of the parts that's probably like in your head, and it's one that I underlined when you were talking about like, and I think angry isn't an unfair word to use. Like, I think he's like, the anger is justified here. But when he wrote, if his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. And it's like, that's so true. Repression and like holding things in any context, especially in one as heavy as, you know, the civil rights movement, it doesn't do good things for you, and it escalates those feelings. So
I guess like righteous anger would be the way to describe those sections. Like,
I think honestly, even anger is a good description too, because you know, it's something worth being angry over.
Right. But yeah, in terms of like rating and my impressions, I do have, you know, I have a complex rating scale, but I also have a separate one for nonfiction, because that's just the way I work. So for nonfiction, so I did rate this 5 stars. I'll just like be honest, because it's easy rating scale. One is just like writing. One is, I think I phrase it differently, but it's like enjoyment of subject matter or ideas expressed by the author, you know. And then the other thing, how do I say it? I think is just like more about organization. What is it? Yeah, organization, writing, and enjoyment of subject/ideas. So it was an easy 5 stars for me because it was just so powerful and concise and to the point, and I never felt confused, even when he was referencing like specific events that I had never, you know, like specifically read about. I was just like, yeah, okay, like I'm with you. So I really like, I'm so glad you chose this, Taylor, because it was a really good experience reading it, and then low-key rereading it to annotate this when I got it.
Yeah. No, I'm really happy with this pick too. I'm a little proud of myself.
You should be.
Yes.
It was really good. And I think what I keep hearing you two mention the writing, and I do want to go into that because it is, I feel like a lot of academic writing now is trying to like one up everyone and show everyone how smart you are and how verbose you can be. And what I liked about this letter was that it was obviously longer than any letter would be, but it got his points across, and I felt like a succinct manner. There was evidence, appeals to religiosity, and facts that were going on as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have complicated feelings with describing like Black people as articulate, but I want to say it was very articulate. The word choice was complex, but also understandable to the layman. Someone who might not have had as extensive an education as he had could pick this up and read it and most likely understand it, which I love how accessible it is as a text. Yes. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think its accessibility is one of its strengths because it can like transcend so many groups, like you said, like a scholarly person or just like a layman, but also I think like it appeals specifically to religious people and then talks about more like, that's not a dichotomy. I was going to say logical, and I was like, religious people are also logical. That's just not what I meant. You know what I mean?
Secular, yeah,
like more secular, like maybe politicians or like just common regular folk. Like there's something in it that can speak to everyone who reads it, which I think is a huge part of its strength.
Yeah. And also like the message is great. I agree with like most of what's in there, and I mean, obviously, I'm not going to read it based off of how much I agree with it. There are a lot of books I've read with messages that I don't necessarily agree with, but I really enjoyed. Right. But like his points were really well made, and I think part of it is given what happened last year and what's going on now with the Chauvin trial, a lot of it is just so relevant to today, and it's just a shame it's not taught more. I feel. Yeah.
That was one thing that like really surprised me listening to it, was how relevant it still felt. I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be like a landmark, like a historical piece of writing. And I was like, oh my God, no wonder people are still sharing these quotes.
Yeah.
They are all still, they're all applicable still.
Yeah. And like the specificity that is so applicable, you know, like it's not just like, oh yes, these ideas, like these, like racism is still a problem in the US. It's like specific examples that he mentions. I'm like, this happened like 3 weeks ago, you know, like, for sure.
Yeah. And actually, speaking about the parallels, I wanted to like maybe talk about some of the parallels to modern day, and it doesn't just have to be with like tragedy per se, but there was, and I have to find it, a parallel that I sort of was looking at that I sort of related to some of the anti-cancel culture people. See if I can find it. So part of their, I guess, like the pastors or whatever, or the religious people, I can't remember who they were exactly, but I'm pretty sure they were like fellow pastors. Their complaints was that they were not doing it the right way by boycotting and so on. So he writes, so the purpose of the direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. We therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in this tragic attempt to live in the monologue rather than the dialogue. And I sort of like related it. It's not directly related to cancel culture, but the idea of creating action to sort of open up a conversation to begin with. And I feel like when people complain about cancel culture, they're complaining about people calling out someone or boycotting something that they create and saying that it's wrong. Whereas I think we live in a society where we sort of vote with our dollar in a way. So if a company does something that's racist, you know, I'm going to tell my, you know, I'm going to announce that maybe I won't buy from them anymore. And I'll tell my friends, like, you shouldn't, like, obviously you can, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but this is what this company does. But there's so many people who are like, that's cancel culture, you shouldn't do that. And I don't know, like, that's sort of what I drew from part of this, just sort of how conversations get shut down. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the fact that even well, I don't want to say like the early part of the civil rights movement, because obviously abolition was a thing for a very long time, but the early part of this specific part of the civil rights movement, like it was still kind of voting with your dollar, by boycotting public transportation. Like that was a financial message. So yeah, it's like that's still when people act like today, like you're overreacting for not wanting to support somebody. It's like I'm not saying that if you still go see this movie or whatever that you are doing the same thing, but you're kind of communicating that it's not a deal breaker for you, know. And I don't think it's unreasonable where, Taylor, like you say, in a society that you kind of vote with your dollar, I'm going to be particular about where I put it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that my brain melted the sentence that I had, and now I have to reformulate the sentence. But yeah, I don't think it's like, how was I thinking this a second ago? I guess I'll go with that like movie example of like, it's expressing to other people what your concerns are, So like I could say, oh, that director of that movie, I don't want to support them because of, X reason. And if my friend is like, well, it's just a movie, who cares? It's like, you can still go see the movie. I'm not going to stop you from seeing the movie. I'm not trying to get all of the theaters to shut down the movie. I'm saying, here's where I'm going to take my own stance and say, because this factor is something I don't want to support, I'm going to go see this movie or read a book this weekend. It's not a call to arms that like, it's over. It's just like, here's where I'm going to draw my own personal line. I suggest you join me. You don't have to.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point you made, Julia, that like there can be, it's almost like there's two approaches or two intentions when you decide not to spend your money somewhere. There can be, like with the bus boycott, they were trying to get enough people to do it that it would actually have an effect, which it did. But there's also a part where it's like, yeah, I don't think like me choosing not to buy something on Amazon today is not going to make Jeff Bezos like poor, sadly. But there is that sense of like, I at least want to know that I didn't give him money today, like, so it's that feeling of like, personally, like I know in my heart that I have not supported this thing, even if it doesn't immediately translate into something big. Although like, you get enough individual people doing that and you can have an effect. So
yeah. I just keep thinking like, if all of this was happening today, it would have been like Martin Luther King Jr. cancels like counters. And all of these like right-wing and centrist commentators on YouTube are like, he cancels buses.
Martin Luther King Jr. problematic because like,
they would literally be spinning it to be like, he doesn't care about poor people. He doesn't want them to have public transportation. It's like, that's not the point. Like, are you kidding me?
Yes.
It would be a mess.
Now I want to see the fake YouTube thumbnail, like Martin Luther King cancels.
I'm sure the Onion has done something about that. Like, Oh, also, while we're on the topic of like parallels to today, one of the ones that I wanted to mention, which is a quote that we've all discussed a few times, I'm going to just, if it's okay, I'm just going to read a part of it. So that I have a better, let's see if I can find it. I even tab it and I can't find it. Okay. So this is like the white moderate quote that we've been talking about. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So, like, I think that section has a lot of parallels to things going on today. But one of the things that it made me think of that is not like, I mean, it is related to racism in the U.S., but it's not like as obviously connected. Is it made me think a lot about the Capitol being stormed in January. and how I don't necessarily know that like, oh, the right wing is not as big of a threat as like the centrist people in the middle. I don't necessarily know if I agree with that, because like right wing's pretty bad. But what it made me think of is like, I really do feel like one of the big obstacles right now is that people are trying to make peace too quick. It's like maybe, and there was discussion about this in January, ongoing obviously, but that section really made me think about how like sometimes it's the people who try to like say that they're making peace, or like reaching across the aisle and working together, and it's like, that's great, but we do need to address what happened first. So anyway, I don't know, I don't feel like that was a very coherent way of describing that, but that section, that section made me think about some of that discussion that was happening a few months ago.
Yeah, and it also like makes me think of like, some people are like, oh, no, I want to see both sides, but there isn't always a both sides. And in some cases, I'd rather prefer to like interact with someone on the complete opposite side, because I at least know what I'm getting. But with someone, like someone who's more like inclined to negotiate my right or like my friend's rights to exist is like different.
Like, let's hear them out.
Guy with the flag out here.
Okay. Can I share one of my favorite quotes then? Because I think that applies exactly. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Like, sometimes it is black and white, friends, and not racially in terms of morality. Like, supporting people and keeping them alive and giving them rights, good thing. We like that. Like, I'm sorry, I can't.
I remember seeing like a couple months ago, I think somebody on Twitter was talking about, I think they might have been a historian or like maybe a political scientist. They were talking about in South Korea a few years ago, and I'm going to be very like generalizing here because I don't remember all the details, because this was not something I had heard of before. There was like something happened with the government of South Korea where like basically the new group coming into power is like, let's like spring clean basically and get rid of all these like racists and like all these other like bad elements that had been like part of the previous administration. And so they did that. They like basically removed them from positions of power. They put in like more progressive people and everything. And the way that this was happening, like I think it was the UN that actually like downgraded their democracy because they were like, oh no, it's a coup. And the person analyzing this was talking about how like to maybe outside observers it looked like, uh-oh, like what's happening. But the thing that was actually happening was accountability, where they were like, hey, you did this really horrible thing. Maybe we don't want you in office anymore. And they did that on like a big enough scale that it made people nervous. And then one of the things that this commentator said that really has like stuck with me is they talked about like in a democracy, like the whole point of a democracy is, well, okay, freedom of speech, people love to misuse the way you can use that, but it's, like the freedom, it's about like freedom of choice and freedom of speech and all of that. But the one thing, like you can hold any opinion in a democracy, but the one opinion you can't hold is to have no democracy. And like that's the difference. Like that's where I like we were saying, sometimes it is a yes or no, like a binary black or white, like some things are good and some things are bad. And one of the things that is bad is saying we're in a democracy and we can't have a democracy. So anyway, that was kind of like a very long example, but that's just something I like have been thinking about a lot, and I think fits in really well with those quotes that we were sharing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, something else that I was thinking of too while I was reading this was also drawing parallels between this and Colin Kaepernick as well, who chose to do a peaceful protest and was, kicked out of the NFL for it. But so there were so many people saying like that's not the way to do it. And then when Black Lives Matter protests happened over this last summer and they were peaceful, people were like, that's not how to do it. But then when they like, when they broke out more, they were still like, that's not how you do it. Okay, well, how is it supposed to happen?
Right, yeah.
Like Martin Luther King, oh, here it is. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, etc.? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. And yeah, I don't know. Just the idea that like there's one way to protest, but also not that way. And I think a lot of people today also forget that so many people disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s tactics back then.
Mm-hmm.
I guess they were just less objectionable than other more radical tactics.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was literally, as you were like giving this whole build up, I was like, that's it, I need to find the quote. And then you started reading the quote. And I was like, oh, bless you. Thank you.
Same wavelength.
Yeah. But I totally agree. That was the same thing I thought about, where, you know, how, you know, in the heat of things, like last summer, I would have conversations with people close to me who would be like, well, I of course think Black Lives Matter, but I can't support, you know, looting and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, but no one was listening. So like, you know, it's literally like a toddler in a way, where if they are trying to show you something, you can be on the phone and they're going to say your name and say your name and say your name and say your name until you pay attention. And if you don't pay attention, and a tantrum is going to ensue. And then you're like, oh my gosh, why are you crying? Because we said your name. We said mommy 18 times. You didn't look. And this got your attention. The tantrum worked. It did its job. So it's like, just address things before they become an issue, you know?
Yeah.
There's this idea like that people aren't going to reach a breaking point. And there's only so long before, you know, people are going to reach that breaking point.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he talks about that too, about how like people will say like, just give it time. Like it took time for abolition to happen, while also ignoring the fact that there were also like protests and speeches and a lot of groundwork as well. People always tend to forget like the past or sanitize it in a way. And Martin Luther King Jr. is like, time is neutral. Stuff has to happen in that time. Also, asking people to wait like 30 years is ridiculous.
Yeah. And like that makes me think of another thing that we talked about a lot with him in school versus what we didn't, which I'm pretty sure we shared that quote multiple times, where it's like the arc of the universe is long, but it is bent towards justice, which I feel like was taken completely out of context, because in this letter, he's talking about how like time does not automatically make things better. Like, there has been progress because people make progress happen. And I definitely don't think we emphasized that enough when we were talking about him. Also, just like with the looting thing we were talking about, did you guys also see that report that came out? It might have been last fall, I don't remember, but like they had compiled data on like all of these protests happening like across the country, and I think it was something like 97% or something were peaceful. And like the ones that weren't, it was usually like instigators who were like from like outside groups, like right-wing extremist groups, who like came in to like mess everything up. So it's like, this was an excuse to say that you don't want, like, that you don't agree like with what they're saying. It's like, yeah, you're saying that you agree and you just don't like their methods, but when you're shown that their methods are something that you say you agree with, you're still not on board. So like, think about that.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's the other thing too, like the media is always going to sort of like, I don't know, show what I guess is going to get clicks and views and so on, and that's
the most sensational.
Exactly. And I guess peaceful protests don't make interesting news.
Oh, people stood there with signs for so many days. We want something more interesting. Oh, look, a broken window. Like,
yeah,
we get it, reporters. We see your game.
Yeah.
Something else that doesn't really have to do with like modern day parallels, but something that I thought was really interesting was talking about how he talks about how they got ready for the peaceful protest. Like, so we decided to go through a process of self-purification. We started having workshops on nonviolence and repeatedly asked ourselves the questions: are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeals of jail? which I thought was just really interesting. And the idea of like workshops and so on.
Yeah.
I just thought that was fascinating.
I think the first volume of the March graphic novel, which I still need to continue that, but the first volume was great, just like everyone says it is. But they talk about that specifically. They like show scenes from that, and I remember reading that like, I don't think we ever talked about that either. Like, we never discussed like the training where it's like, all right, people are going to try to break your bones and yell disgusting words at you, and like you can't use violence, but they are going to, and like how do you train people to be ready for that? So yeah, like I also thought, I had forgotten that maybe we didn't read that part in class, but like I had forgotten that part was in this letter as well.
Yeah. That was something I had never heard of. It makes sense now that I think about it, because if your movement is nonviolence, you want to sort of weed out like hotheads or people who aren't going to be able to handle something like this, which it's tough.
Yeah. But it is amazing. I know that's something we definitely never were taught in school, that he was like, and then he prepared all these people and like, you know, got them ready for this movement, which is, wow.
Did we have any other modern day parallels, or should we move on to the next topic?
Let me do a quick flick through here.
Yeah.
See where my tabs are.
Here's something.
Oh, goody.
I thought it was interesting where near the end he says like, but before closing, I am impelled to mention one other point in your statement that troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would observe their ugly, inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you would watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls. If you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys. If you will observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department, which I thought was also really interesting. Sort of like also white moderate like support of police brutality, and saying like, oh well, they're just keeping the peace, but keeping the peace at what cost, and keeping the peace for who?
And what peace are children and elderly people disturbing? Like, you know, truly, like,
right.
And we are still seeing things just like that, whether or not in jail or not. So it's there was like, not to get into things that are too graphic, but I remember during the protest last year, there was a little girl who was pepper sprayed, and people were saying like, well, the police were just like doing their jobs, and it's like, well, she's a child. What's she gonna do to this big bad 38-year-old man, you know?
Also, like, the just doing their jobs, it's like, that's the problem. Literally the point. It's like, you train people to do this. Also, one thing that you guys reminded me of before we like move to the next question. So talking about parallels to today, one of the things I marked is sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. And he gives the examples of parading without a permit. And he's like, that's a fine law, but if you only apply it to Black people, not a great law. And that I thought was really interesting, because like, it makes me think about how like, okay, nowadays, like all the voter suppression laws, none of the voter suppression laws say Black people can't vote, but if they're targeting a demographic through other means, it's like you have to look at who's affected by the law. Like if you see a law and it looks neutral, but it's like, weird that this only stops people of color from voting. It's like probably a racist law, even if it doesn't actually exclude people in the text. So I just thought that was a really salient point today as well.
Right.
There was a line too about voter suppression as well, and I have to see if I can find it. But he did bring that up, like something about like a county of predominantly Black people, but almost none of them can vote.
Yes.
I probably can't find it. There's just so much in here.
I know.
I had to stop myself from doing what I would do in college, which is like I would open up my textbook and go, I will only highlight things that I think will be important to know. And it's like
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it's you laying down a translucent yellow page on top of the page.
Yeah.
Okay, that page is important.
Yeah.
And this one.
The only way I could stop myself from doing that, which is part of the reason why I rarely annotate books, is I was like, I'm only going to mark quotes that I feel like we might share. Like, not just good quotes or like quotes I think are important, but like only ones where it's like, in the context of this live show, these will be discussion points.
It was hard. After a while, I went to like, okay, I'll just block them off. Look here, I blocked off like half the page and a little bit on the next page. I was like, this is all important.
Yep.
That was like my favorite thing about doing an audiobook, though, is that when I came back to this to annotate, I was like, okay, think of those parts that are still really vivid in your head. Let's find those ones. And like, that's our, our goal. And then on the way, I was like, oh, that's a good one. Oh, yeah, that one too. Just like a couple peppered in. But yeah, it's hard.
So my next question is, like, is there anything about this letter that doesn't work in this or has not aged well? Because it was written in, I believe they said 1963. So obviously there might be some things. And I'm saying this because there was one thing I saw, and I have to see if I can find it. But I don't know if either of you have anything.
The only thing I remember coming across, well, it's kind of like two related things, but it's the same thing. I noticed there were at least once, and possibly more than that, he said something about Judeo-Christian values, which like Judeo-Christian is not a super helpful term, and it tends to like conflate Judaism with Christianity, which is like problematic in itself. So that was one of the things where I'm like, okay, we wouldn't say that today, and kind of related to that. But I think this also is part of the context he was writing in. But when he's talking about the religious imperative to do good, which I think is a good point, and I actually really liked a lot of things he said about that. But it tended to be like he would address like Jewish and Christian brothers, and like that was pretty much it. But again, I do think he was writing specifically to an organization of, like, I think it was like the Southern, I want to say it was something like Southern Christian Brotherhood or something like that. So I think there's reasons for it, but that was one of the only things where I'm like, this probably would be done differently today. But yeah, that was the only thing I remember coming across.
Yeah, I think nowadays the more proper term would be to refer to it as an Abrahamic religion, which would also encompass Islam as well.
Right.
Because all three technically share a god and share, like, I guess a lot of the early people like Abraham and so on.
Yeah.
But, they sort of diverge at some point. So I think Abrahamic religion would be better, but people tend to use Judeo-Christian, which leaves out Islam.
Yes. Yeah, I should have been more specific with that. That was another point on that. So thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, no problem. Like, no problem. It's like, I don't know. It's one of those things that people don't really talk about, but I think the term Judeo-Christian is quickly going out of fashion.
Yes.
Something that I thought was sort of discussion about like people who have issues with Christianity. There was some wording around here. I have it blocked off. So let's see. One is a force of complacency made up of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, have been so completely drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodiness that they have adjusted to segregation, and of a few Negroes in the middle class who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because at points they profit by segregation, have unconsciously become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various Black national groups that are springing up over the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. This movement is nourished by the contemporary frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. It is made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incurable devil. I have tried to stand between those two forces, saying that we need not follow the do-nothingism of the complacent or the hatred and despair of the Black nationalist. So I will admit that I don't know much about Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. I don't, but that did sort of like,
rubs you the wrong way.
Yeah, it does. And like I said, it's something that I'd have to read into more, but I was a little bit like, okay, I don't know about that one.
Yeah,
Also the idea of people who have repudiated Christianity. And I feel like, I don't know, he's obviously a reverend and very religious, and it is the 1960s, but I don't know, something about that was like, well, they don't need to embrace Christianity.
Right, and
angry.
That was... Yeah, sorry, Taylor, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that was one of the things, too, and I think I must have... I don't think I marked the parts that I was kind of like, because for whatever reason, I didn't think to tab those parts, but that was another one that I'm glad you mentioned. And one of the things about that, too, is, like, people being part of one religion versus another is not, like, repudiating a different religion. Like, that's not what it's about. Yeah, and I think, like you were saying, it's like the 1960s, and obviously he's a reverend, but yeah, it's definitely, there's parts of this that are much more Christian-centric, which he's writing to primarily, I think, other Christian, like, pastors and reverends.
I found it.
You found it?
It was a response to 8 white Alabama clergymen. So.
Okay, so that is Christian then. So that does make a little sense, but yeah, definitely for him to, and specifically to identify it as like the Black Muslim movement is, not.
Yeah. I
not
know,
great.
Like the Muslim Brotherhood, I believe, like also there were a lot of Black Panthers who belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, including Malcolm X, but I don't know. I feel like their religion is separate from what was considered their extremist views, which I think by today's standards are not that extremist. A lot of the Black Panthers things were like hyped up, and no one talked about like their breakfast programs and like what they did or how they carried guns to protect people in their neighborhoods because the police weren't going to protect them.
Which, speaking of which, you guys, if you have not read this, you should read One Crazy Summer by Rita Williams Garcia. It's a middle grade book that actually talks about some of the breakfast programs of the Black Panthers. And I have to give a shout out to Ashley from Bookish Realm because I had not even heard of this series, and it's really great. I'm going to drop the title in the chat because it is so good and more people should read it.
One Crazy Summer?
Yes, One Crazy Summer. So it's like these 3 sisters whose their mother left when the youngest was just a baby, and their dad is like, well, you should go spend time with your mother. So one summer they get sent to Oakland to stay with them, and this is during, I think it's like late 60s. I don't remember the time period exactly. But yeah, they start out, like the 3 girls, they start out being very like, what's going on? Like we don't, I don't remember if they had been like told that the Black Panthers were bad or what happened, but yeah, it talks a lot about their breakfast program and like the fact that they were taking care of communities that nobody else was. And like a lot of times, if we talk about the Black Panthers at all, it's very much like the like extremists and like the like even taking things that they did and like making it sound violent and threatening when it wasn't. Like some of the protests they were doing, it's like, okay, but they weren't hurting people. They were like, let this 17-year-old kid out of jail kind of thing. Anyway, so I'm going to put that title here. But I'm sorry for interrupting, but I was like, this is a perfect time to recommend this.
Thank you for the recommendation.
And actually, speaking of book recommendations, Helen did drop a book rec in there. So it's called, there's an amazing book called Have I Ever Told You Black Lives Matter by Shani King that talks about a lot of lesser known important figures throughout Black history. I really recommend it.
I literally just added both of these to my TBR.
I'm going to add that right now. Thank you, Helen.
They both sound great.
Yeah, all good stuff. But something about, like, I don't know, conflating Christianity or saying, like, people might leave Christianity. And I'm like, well, they might have other issues.
Or maybe some different factors.
Like, I don't really talk about my religion here, but I'm a semi-practicing Catholic, and it's like, no, I get it.
Yes. And I like, too, the part where he says, he's talking about how you can be part of something and be like, we need to fix things wrong with it. Like, that's not contradictory. So
yeah, like, hi, I'm an American citizen, but I think we should change a couple things in this country. You know? Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
This is
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
this is more on the religious note, but I recently started watching. Have either of you or anyone in the chat heard of the channel God is Gray, like the color?
Oh, I have heard.
She is so fascinating. I love her. So she's like a progressive Christian, and so she'll just like break down all these different issues that like very conservative people are normally like, abortion, bad, gay people, bad, da da da. And she's like, okay, yes, but no. And she'll just like talk about it in a very like in a religious manner because she's a Christian, but I'm like mesmerized by her. She wrote a memoir that I want to read. Like, I think she's just the coolest person. So
I'll have to look into that.
Watch her stuff. She was recommended to me by another YouTuber, and I'm like, oh, I should watch her stuff. But then I just totally forgot.
Yeah, I'll have to look into her. That sounds really great, really interesting.
Binge watching her videos, and I think her memoir is called "On Her Knees," like a pun on sexually and prayerfully. Because I think it's mostly about like I don't want to say like about her sex life because that's a weird way to say it, but you know how the conservative not movement group, I don't know what word I'm looking for here, view it's okay, it's like anti-purity culture,
right? Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
I am definitely inclined to like watch something like that from like a woman, because there was like, this is totally off topic, but there was this other YouTuber I was watching who was like making comments about the Girl Defined girls and their response to purity culture, but it felt weird coming from a guy saying like, oh, you should have sex before marriage, and I'm like, well, hold on here.
Yeah.
Like a man telling you,
right? It's like the point is that you can choose, like.
And also, I don't like a guy telling women what they can do with their bodies.
Honestly,
don't agree with them spreading a specific message. I'm like, you stay out of this.
No one asked you.
You're not a woman in religion. You don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that purity culture was started by a man anyways. It's like, sir, mind your business. Like,
yeah.
I can't believe you made me defend the Girl Defined girls. Don't do it.
Also, like, not to get too far like further into this tangent, but like also a lot of the things that it sounds like she's talking about, it's like this like conservative movement is like we're going back to the way things used to be, and it's like that's actually a very recent thing. Like for a long time, abortion was not connected with Christianity at all. Like it was deliberately constructed as a like voting block issue.
Yes.
And it clearly worked. Like, so anyway, that was like my last thing with this.
Wait, can I do one more then?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things too that I think is really interesting. Sorry, my like little tablet thing keeps leaning more and more towards me, and I'm like getting my head chopped off. One of the things she talks about that is like most interesting to me, because like one thing, you know, like when she'll talk about abortion, is she'll be like, we actually agree on this issue. Like, I don't want more abortions than are necessary in the world. However, the laws that are pro-life create more abortions in that people don't have good sexual health education, people don't have family planning, people don't have access to birth control. Hence, there's more need for abortion. So like, get it straight, people.
I know. And that's like the frustrating thing is like, everyone should be fighting for the same thing, which is like better prenatal care and like better sex education. And like, it's
wild.
Back on track.
We're like, just like veering the train back onto the track.
Yeah, I love that.
About religion, and we just sort of shimmy to it.
Yeah. Although actually, this does tie in really well, because one of the quotes I marked is when he's saying, like, this is one of the ones that I really liked when he like connected religion with social causes. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular. So like it does fit into what we were discussing, because it's like when people say that like, oh, but blank is not political, it's like everything is.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for bringing us back here. That was
Goodness, back on topic.
Well, Taylor, you had said at the beginning, you're like, this will probably be shorter than our usual live show. I'm like, listen, the text is shorter, but have you heard us talk? I think we'll be able to stretch this out just fine.
I know. I'm so sad that I underestimated us, and I was like, oh goodness, I hope this isn't going to be too serious. I want this to at least be entertaining to watch. And here we are ranting about the girl-defined girls and me having to be forced to defend them.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I feel like this has been a good mix of like serious and levity. So
yeah.
Ew, not a total downer of a live show.
Good job, team.
So if there's nothing else that we want to discuss, we can move on to quotes. But I don't know if there's anything else anyone wanted to bring up, or
I feel like the quotes will kind of lead us into any other topics that we want.
Probably. I feel like we've gone through so many quotes.
I know. Yeah, we keep sharing.
I have this one highlighted that we haven't talked about yet, but it does tie back into the whole, not necessarily, but mostly kind of the white moderate section, even though it's not a part of it. It says, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people."
Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, he said that, and I went, ooh, okay, yeah. Because that's another really relevant one where people are like, your silence is saying a lot. Like, you know, what you don't say is reflective of how you're feeling about current events. So
yeah, it's like that whole what you permit, you promote. Like if you don't actively come out against something wrong, you're tacitly endorsing it, you know? Yeah, that was a good quote.
I love that quote.
I really like that saying, what you permit, you promote. That was, that's good.
I have no idea who first said that, but I've like seen that a lot, and it's like, what a great encapsulation of like this very, I don't know, not even complicated idea, because it's not complicated, but like this, like you could try and explain this idea for like, you know, in these long paragraphs, like, or you could just say it like that, which pretty much sums it up, which is ironically, I've been rambling trying to explain that.
I was trying to find whoever said that. I don't know who Michael Josephson is, but he said apparently, what you allow, you encourage, which is similar.
Yeah.
But I like the alliteration of what you said.
Nice and snappy.
Josephson.
Let me see if
I'm like trying to narrow them down.
I know. Yeah. Well, this one, I don't think we talked about this one already, but we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed.
Yes.
And I feel like that feeds right into what we were discussing with like direct action, you know, like nonviolent protest as a way to like force change. Yeah, and this is also about timing. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. Yeah, it's like real easy to tell people, everyone just calm down when it does not affect your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like, sorry, there's never a good time to feel like uncomfortable and be like, oh, this is a convenient time for protests in my neighborhood. It's like, you know, when it's needed, it's needed. Like,
right. This fits into my schedule nicely. Yeah. Let's do it now. Like,
let's see.
I'm sorry. Were you going to share one, Taylor?
I'm stuck between two, but I'll go with this. We know through pain, and this might have already been shared. I apologize if it has. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well timed according to the timetable for those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think I must have forgotten to mark this one, probably because I don't know. Maybe I thought it was like, oh, it's so famous, I'm going to remember it, but clearly not. But it was the one about, I don't even know where it was now, but it was like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
It's on page 2, baby.
There we go. I was like, I thought it was at the beginning, and for whatever reason, I just did not mark that.
Yeah, he went right in and he was like, listen, I'm going to give him a quote to remember.
Yes.
He did it.
Yeah.
That was also, like halfway down the newspaper margin. He was like, yes.
Right. And like, just going along with what we were saying, where like, he just, jotted this down, like, off the cuff. And like, the fact that not only has this become such a standout, like, piece of nonfiction and like piece of history and social causes, but that so many lines in it are like, I don't know, like, iconic sounds kind of like flippant, but you know what I mean? It's like, it's like you're on one page and it's like, oh, there's like 4 famous quotes in a row. Like, it's just incredible.
I know. I think it says something, maybe not for the best, about the American education system, but like as I was listening to the audiobook, I'd be like, I know that quote from Instagram. Like, someone shared that.
Yeah.
There's so many famous ones.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I saw the white moderate one quoted on Twitter in the context of, we don't talk about the Martin Luther King Jr. who said this a lot, which like is true.
Yeah. You always hear the like, not judge people by the color of their skin or the content of their character, which is true, but people use that as like we are not even gonna look at color.
Yeah.
I don't see color. Yeah.
Like, no, see it, acknowledge it. Hello.
Yeah. Like, who are you lying to?
Yeah.
I think you need to get your eyes checked.
Right. It's like,
yeah, I don't see color. Oh my God, you'll never be a pilot. I'm so sorry.
I see everyone is purple.
The purple, like.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was agreeing. It was like it's like, I don't care if you're like white, black, purple. Like,
well, who was the last purple person you met? Like,
are you thinking of Grimace?
Well, but the point is, Julia, they would not discriminate against purple people.
Okay. But what if they were a flying purple people eater? Then would they discriminate because they're here to eat us? See? Take that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
this has devolved.
We're talking about purple people.
It goes in waves. Like,
someone's like, I don't care if you're blue. It's like, no, they're suffocating.
Yeah.
I don't see color.
Violet Beauregard.
Oh my gosh.
Violet Beauregard, I don't care if you're black, white, brown, purple, berries.
Berry.
But yeah, I think we've covered everything that I had written down. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say. I am very pleased we took it to over an hour.
We did it.
Honestly, we should not have doubted. Like,
I was so worried we would be done in like half an hour and we'd have like nothing to say.
Yeah. No, he gave us a few words, but many thoughts.
Yes.
Exactly.
So, good stuff.
Yeah, but thank you everyone for tuning in to our plastic class.
You said it.
Oh, sorry. I just want to bring this up, and I know I haven't been showing a lot of comments, and this is going to be a very self-centered comment. Off-topic, Taylor, but I have those.
I was looking at those.
They're so pretty.
They're so cute.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
And I got daisies.
I love the daisies. I love like the green theme, Cara. Everyone is serving
this eyeshadow. Stunning.
Thank you.
Nana, I'm so happy you have these earrings. I love them so much. They're very cosmic.
Where did you get them from? Because, like, I'm low-key tempted to.
I got them from, I believe, Forever 21 a couple months ago.
Okay.
I love them.
They're very cute. I was, like, actually looking at them before that, so I'm glad Nana brought it up.
Yeah. She gave us an excuse to talk about what we were all thinking about.
Right.
Cute earring.
Yes.
That's the only one brave enough to thinking.
She took one for the team. Thanks, Nana.
Let's see if I can say this properly now. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into our Past It Classics live show, and for listening to us discuss Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. Our next show will be on Cara's channel, and we will be discussing Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I'm super excited for that one. I love the movie. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about, too.
I have an exciting announcement about Rebecca. I told Taylor and Cara that I was not going to reread it because I had just read it in October, but I've since changed my mind and I am going to reread it. I'm just really in the mood for it all of a sudden.
Perfect.
So, the good news is that I'm going to be reading our book. Go figure.
Yay!
It's a good one, though.
For this one. I love the Hitchcock film. Super problematic, but it's a favorite of mine.
As Hitchcock himself was.
Yeah, I was going to say, Hitchcock himself, his own problematic deal, but hello, the new Rebecca movie?
I haven't seen the new one yet.
Not even the movie, just everything surrounding the movie.
The actor?
Yeah, before and after and just all of it. Yeah, a mess. Hot mess. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Don't look it up.
Did I mention anything?
You're better off not knowing. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you so much, Cara and Julia. And I was going to thank myself for some reason.
Thank you for hosting.
Taylor, appreciate your own good work.
Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Rebecca's kind of a